Hello and welcome to the English Box. Today we're talking about advanced conditionals. We're going to start by looking at the use of were in the second conditional as the past subjunctive, and then we're going to look at some different structures that can be used in the second and third conditionals. So if we look at the first slide, you can see the second conditional with was and were. Now were is used in the second conditional often as a preference to was, because were sounds more formal and more elegant. So if we look at the whiteboard, it says in unreal conditional sentences, that's the second conditional, we can use were after any subject in the if clause. So normally I would say I was, you were, he was, or she was, or it was, we were, and they were. But in a second conditional, you can say if I were, if you were, and also if he were, if she were, and if it were. This is the past subjunctive, as I said, and sounds more formal. On the whiteboard, we have two more examples. If he were rich, I would still be with him. Okay, the typical words of a gold digger. And if it were not for his excellent biology teacher, he would never have chosen to study the subject. In both these examples, we can see second conditionals, and in both these examples, we see the verb to be in its past subjunctive form, were. We also use were when we give advice. So if you look at number 2, it says we tend to use were with if I were you to give advice. So if I were in your position, if I were in your situation, if I were in your shoes, then I would do something to counteract your problem or to solve your problem. So we have two more examples, two typical sentences, I think, of mothers. So you look very thin. If I were you, I'd eat a little bit more. Likewise, you look a little bit fat. If I were you, I'd eat a little bit less. Your exams are very important. I'd study harder if I were you. So on this slide, we can see how we use were in the past subjunctive form in the second conditional. Now we're going to look at some different structures that can be used. Again, this makes the language sound and seem a little bit more elegant and a little bit more elaborate and gives you a bit more variety. So when we talk about imaginary situations in the second and third conditional, we can remove the if from the conditional and invert the subject and verb. This will become a little bit more clear when we look at the examples. So if he were rich, I would still be with him. We can take away the if, and we can put the were first, the verb, and then the subject. So were he rich, I would still be with him. And if I had known he would arrive late, I would not have got up so early. Had I known he would arrive late, I would not have got up so early. Now we're going to look at some exercises. I'm going to pause the video and I would like you to decide or establish how these sentences should sound and look in the new form that we have just learned. So, if you can change these conditionals into conditionals without if. Number 1, if I had had enough money, I would have bought the car. Number 2, if he had seen the car a little earlier, he wouldn't have been run over. And number 3, if I were in my teens, I wouldn't sit around all day watching the television. So the answers are, number 1, had I had enough money, I would have bought the car. Number 2, had I seen the car a little earlier, he wouldn't have been run over. And number 3, were I in my teens, I wouldn't sit around all day watching the television, says the grumpy old man. Moving on from these different structures, the next slide is on conditionals again, on the second and third conditionals, and the fact that we can sometimes replace the if with a number of different options. Here we have three options, the words supposing, suppose, and imagine. So instead of beginning the second and third conditionals with if, we can begin them with supposing, suppose, and imagine to speculate about what would happen if a certain situation arose or occurred. So for example, in number 1, with the money. Likewise, we could say, if I won the lottery, what would we do with the money? Number 2, imagine I hadn't approached your mother in the bar. You wouldn't exist, son. One of those stories that you don't want to hear from your father. So in both these sentences, you can replace supposing and imagine with if. If we look at some exercises now, you have 3 if clauses, and you simply have to turn these into clauses, conditionals with supposing, imagine, and suppose. So number 1, you would like to have a picnic to celebrate your birthday, would you? But if it rained, what would we do? If you were to change this, you could say you would like to have a picnic to celebrate your birthday, would you? Supposing it rained, what would we do? Number 2, the staff at the airline are on strike. If they are still on strike this time next week, how are we going to get to our hotel? You could say the staff at the airline are on strike. Imagine they are still on strike this time next week. What are we going to, or how are we going to get to our hotel? And number 3, if there were no countries, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. You may recognize this sentence from a famous song. You can replace the if with imagine. Imagine there were no countries, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. You could also replace the if with suppose or supposing, but it wouldn't resonate quite so much as it does thanks to the John Lennon song.